In a world where people often tell you what you can and can't do, there's always that one person who refuses to listen to the rules and decides to carve their own path. This is the story of a man who broke every stereotype, overcame every obstacle, and proved that no matter where you come from or what people expect from you, the only thing that truly limits you is the belief that you can't go further. Meet Derrick, a man whose life has been anything but ordinary. Growing up in a neighborhood where dreams seemed out of reach, Derrick's story begins like many others, filled with struggles, setbacks, and an almost constant fight against expectations. But from an early age, Derrick had something that set him apart, a relentless love for motorcycles. It wasn't just a hobby, it was his escape, his passion, and his vision of freedom. While others in his community were caught in the routine of just getting by, Derrick's mind was always racing toward the open road. A black man with dreams bigger than most could see, he found his purpose in the roar of the engine, the feel of the wind against his face, and the sense of belonging he could only find in the biking world. But of course, the road to success wasn't going to be a smooth one. From the start, Derrick faced challenges that many couldn't even imagine. Being a black biker in a predominantly white subculture came with its own set of difficulties. From suspicion to hostility, Derrick had to fight for his place in a community that didn't always want him there. It was the kind of environment where people looked at him and saw his skin color before they saw his skills or his passion. But Derrick didn't let that stop him. Instead of turning away from the harsh reality, Derrick leaned into it. He poured himself into the sport, constantly refining his craft, learning everything he could about motorcycles, and pushing himself beyond his limits. He refused to let the judgment of others define him. But even as he excelled, the barriers only grew higher. He faced discrimination, isolation, and moments of doubt. There were nights when he thought about giving up, but his love for biking and the dream of proving himself kept him going. Then came a moment that would change everything, a race that would push Derrick to his breaking point. The prize, more than just money or fame, it was about proving that a black man could rise to the top in a world that tried to shut him out. But this race wasn't just about speed or skill, it was a battle for respect. As he revved the engine and prepared to take off, Derrick knew this wasn't just a race, it was a statement. But as he made his way to the starting line, something unexpected happened. A challenge arose that none of the competitors, not even Derrick, saw coming. It wasn't just the people watching who were skeptical about his chances. It was the very system he was trying to break into. There were whispers, strategies being devised behind the scenes, and a pressure to succeed that Derrick had never faced before. The stakes were higher than ever, and then just as the race was about to begin, Derrick received a warning. Someone didn't want him to win. Someone had been watching him for a while, and they weren't about to let this black biker defy all the odds without a fight. The question now wasn't whether Derrick could win the race, but whether he could even make it to the finish line. Was he really ready to face the challenges that lay ahead? Would he be able to overcome not only the race itself, but the forces that sought to stop him from reaching his full potential? The tension was building, and the answer was far from clear. The journey had only just begun. And Derrick, he was ready to prove that he wasn't just a man on a bike. He was a force to be reckoned with, no matter the odds. Stay tuned to find out what happens next in this incredible story of resilience, grit, and the unbreakable spirit of a man who refused to be held back. As Derrick sat on his bike, revving the engine in preparation for the race, the weight of the moment hit him hard. The sounds of the crowd faded into the background as his thoughts raced. He dreamed of this day for years, the day he would finally prove to the world that a black man could rise to the top of the biking world, that his passion and skill were enough to break every barrier. But now, as the reality of the situation settled in, Derrick realized that the odds against him were more than just the people he had to outrun. They were deeply ingrained in the very fabric of the racing world. This race wasn't just a contest of speed and skill. It was a test of everything he had worked for. Derrick knew that, in the eyes of many, a black man in a predominantly white, male-dominated sport was an anomaly. He had spent years pushing himself to be the best, fighting not only on the track, but also off it, challenging biases, facing hostility, and dealing with the cold stares of competitors who didn't want to see him succeed. In the second lap, Derrick noticed something strange. One of the riders, a well-known competitor named Brad, began to pull ahead in a way that didn't quite make sense. Brad had always been skilled, but there was something different about the way he was moving now. Derrick pushed himself harder, trying to catch up, but it was clear that something was off. It wasn't just that Brad was racing better than usual. There was something more, something underhanded going on. Derrick's instincts kicked in, and he began to notice small but telling signs. The way Brad's bike was handling, the way he seemed to have an edge that wasn't explained by skill alone. It was almost as if someone had tampered with the race. His heart raced, not from the speed, but from the realization that there were forces at play that went beyond just competing. Derrick wasn't just racing against other riders. He was racing against an invisible system that had been stacked against him from the start. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a fair fight. There were people who would do whatever it took to make sure he didn't win, no matter how hard he worked or how much he deserved it. As the laps went on, the pressure mounted. Derrick felt the eyes of the crowd on him, and not just the spectators in the stands. There were whispers in the pit, subtle looks exchanged among the sponsors, and murmurs from the organizers. He could feel it. His presence was unsettling to some. To others, he was a reminder of change, of how things were shifting in the world of racing. But not everyone was ready for that change. Derrick knew that as long as he stayed in the race, there would be someone trying to stop him. The thought made his blood boil, but he refused to let it distract him. His goal was still in sight, to cross that finish line first and prove that he belonged. With each lap, Derrick's focus grew sharper. He kept pushing, ignoring the sting in his muscles, the sweat in his eyes, and the rising tension in the pit of his stomach. But then, just as he was about to make his move and overtake Brad, disaster struck. The front tire of his bike began to feel off, sluggish, like it was losing air. Derrick's heart sank. He had been through countless tests and checks to ensure his bike was race-ready, but something was wrong. His mind raced. Was it sabotage? Or was it just a mechanical failure at the worst possible moment? He pushed on, trying to ignore the growing instability in the front tire. But with each turn, it became more difficult to control. He could feel the bike slipping beneath him, and he knew that if he didn't act fast, he might crash out of the race altogether. The clock was ticking, and the finish line was within reach, but it was becoming clear that this race was no longer about speed alone. It was about survival. Derrick's mind raced through every possible solution, every trick he'd learned over the years to keep his bike in top form. But time was running out. He could feel Brad's bike in his rearview mirror, gaining ground, getting closer with each passing second. And then, just as the final lap began, Derrick heard a loud crack. His tire exploded. The sound echoed through the track, and for a split second, everything went silent. Derrick's heart pounded in his chest, the feeling of the world crashing down on him. He had worked so hard, endured so much, and now this. Was this the moment where everything fell apart? But Derrick wasn't one to give up. As the tire deflated, he fought to keep control, trying to maintain his speed, even though it felt like everything was working against him. The world around him blurred as he focused solely on the road. If there was one thing Derrick had learned over the years, it was this. When everything seems lost, that's when you dig deeper. He wasn't about to let a flat tire take away everything he'd worked for. But there was something else, something he hadn't seen coming. A shadow in the distance. Someone else was coming up from behind. Someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. Would Derrick make it to the finish line? Would he be able to hold on to his dream? Or would the forces against him prove too powerful? Stay tuned to see how this race unfolds and how Derrick faces the biggest challenge of his life. As the tire flapped against the road, Derrick's heart raced faster than ever. He fought to keep the bike steady, desperately trying to stay in the race. But with every turn, the reality of his situation hit harder. The crowd's cheers and the roar of the engines felt distant now, like they were happening in another world. His focus was singular, survive. It wasn't just about the race anymore. It was about proving to himself that he was stronger than anything that had tried to break him. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Derrick saw something that made his stomach drop. Brad, the competitor he'd been battling all race, wasn't just speeding ahead. He was pulling off to the side of the track, signaling for help. It was a momentary distraction, but in that brief instant, Derrick realized something he hadn't seen before. Brad wasn't just racing, he was trying to sabotage him. The tire wasn't just a random failure, it had been tampered with. Derrick's mind raced through everything he had encountered up until that point. Whispers, looks from sponsors, the tension in the pits. It wasn't just the race. Brad had played dirty, and Derrick had been the target. Suddenly, the fight became bigger than just proving he could race. It became about standing up against everything that had tried to hold him back. Derrick gritted his teeth, determined not to let Brad's underhanded tactics break him. The bike was unstable, but Derrick's grip on the handlebars tightened, his instincts kicking in. He could feel the weight of history on his shoulders. This wasn't just about him. It was about every black biker who had been pushed aside, every dream that had been dismissed because of the color of their skin. This was his chance to make history. As the final lap loomed, Derrick's tire held on by sheer willpower, and he pushed his bike harder than ever. The finish line was coming up fast, and despite everything that had been thrown his way, he was ahead. The crowd's energy surged, knowing they were witnessing something monumental. Derrick's body ached, his hands shaking with exhaustion, but he didn't slow down. Not now, not after everything he had fought for. And then it happened. As he approached the last stretch, Brad, realizing that Derrick was too far ahead, pulled a last-ditch move to cut him off. But Derrick saw it coming. It was a desperate attempt to take him out of the race, a move that could have ended everything. But Derrick wasn't the same man he was when he first started. He had been tested, and he had learned the hard way that nothing would stop him from achieving his dreams. With a sudden shift, he veered his bike to the side, narrowly avoiding Brad's move and taking the inside track. The finish line was now in sight, and Derrick gave it everything he had left. His heart pounded in his chest, but the exhaustion and the frustration melted away as he crossed that line first. He had done it. Against all odds, he had proved that he belonged, not just as a biker, but as a force in a world that had tried to keep him out. The crowd erupted in cheers, but it wasn't just the win that had everyone talking. It was the way he had earned it. As Derrick slowed to a stop, the weight of the victory started to settle in. It wasn't just about the race anymore. It was about everything that had led to this moment. The years of struggle, the discrimination, the doubt, and the disbelief. He had defied every expectation. The world had told him no, but he had found a way to make it happen. In the aftermath, as Derrick stood by his bike, sweat dripping down his face, he looked out at the crowd, feeling a sense of pride that was bigger than any trophy. He had changed the game, not just for himself, but for everyone who came after him. The story of the black biker who defied all odds wasn't just his story. It was a story for anyone who had ever been told they couldn't make it, anyone who had ever been underestimated. Brad, the man who tried to sabotage him, was disqualified, and his actions became public knowledge. The sponsors who had once whispered about Derrick now had no choice but to acknowledge his victory. But for Derrick, it wasn't about the recognition. It was about the journey, the personal battle that had shaped him into the man who stood before the crowd that day. The ride was never just about the destination. It was about every turn, every challenge, and every moment when it felt like giving up was the easier choice. But Derrick never gave up. He had defied the odds and shown that resilience, determination, and the refusal to accept failure were the keys to success. As he walked away from the track that day, Derrick knew that his story wasn't over. The world had changed, and so had he. And though the race had ended, the fight for respect, equality, and recognition had only just begun. For Derrick, there would always be new roads to travel, new challenges to face, and new victories to claim. But for now, he could finally say that he had defied all odds, and he had won.